Let's talk about the weather. Spring is upon us, sort of. It's felt very elusive, but it's within our grasp. At least we're starting to see some nicer weather for sure out in Eastern Canada. As I was watching the Blue Jays home opener yesterday, and they were talking about why isn't the roof open, which is crazy talk for a home opener in Toronto, but also a bit of some warmer weather happening on the prairies. We're going to break it all down for you in the spring forecast. We've got Scott Kehler. He is the president and chief scientist with Weatherlogics. Hey, Scott, great to have you.
Nice to join you again.
Absolutely. Okay, let's start on the prairies. Why not? What are you expecting for spring here? Because we've heard a lot about the transition out of La Niña and what that could potentially mean. It's still kind of chilly for the fact it's the middle of April. Like I am in Lethbridge here, and usually we're rolling, planting like crazy, and that hasn't happened yet. Manitoba finally starting to warm up a little bit. What are you expecting here for spring?
Well, spring started out different depending whether you're in the Western Prairies or the East. In the West, it was a fairly normal start where you had some warm temperatures early on, and it's cooled off a little bit more recently, but that's not too unusual. However, in the East, they had a deep snowpack through a lot of Saskatchewan into Manitoba, also in the northern U.S., and so things have been very slow to get going there. The month of March didn't even reach above freezing in Winnipeg, and now April's turned around completely, and the snow is almost gone in the Winnipeg area in a matter of days. So we're seeing kind of a big shift that way. As we go forward, I think the month will generally end up around normal for most areas, but that normal will be comprised of a lot of high temperatures on some days and much colder temperatures on others. So it'll be very up and down.
Yeah, well, we've been experiencing the up and down here in Alberta because Sunday, gorgeous. People are out golfing, courses are open. Like it's people are out in their back decks, having a cold one. And today it snowed again, so there's an up and down for you. So, do you though expect from an air temperature standpoint? Do you expect this kind of cool bias to continue into May, or is it going to be a situation where it's like boom? It's like, where did spring go? It's already summer.
Well, it looks like the cool bias is going to linger a little bit longer into April than usual because of the deep snowpack. When you have a deep snowpack, that can cut easily 10 or 15 degrees off air temperatures versus what it otherwise might be. In Manitoba, for example, on Tuesday, had there been no snow, it would have been close to 30 degrees already, but the snow held things down into the mid-teens. As we get later into April, that snow will be gone, so that bias will be removed. Now, I don't think that for most areas it's going to be a super dramatic shift to summer. However, it might feel that way in some cases, especially in a place like Alberta. If you go from snow one day to 30 the next day, that might feel very dramatic, but that's not as unusual. In Manitoba, Saskatchewan, they're probably going to go more like from mid-teens to 20s and then maybe to 30 in May.
What about precipitation? We had a much better growing season in 22 compared to 21. That's that's an understatement. But what are we expecting here for the early part of 23 when it comes to precipitation as we transition out of La Niña?
Well, the forecast we issued for the summer earlier this winter calls for a drier than normal growing season in the Western Prairies and a fairly normal growing season precipitation-wise in the East. However, the West will probably stay drier more generally across the growing season. At least that's our forecast now. Whereas the East, we're expecting to start a little bit wetter in the spring and then become drier as we move later into the summer. So that's a little bit similar to last year, although last year was extremely wet in the spring in the East and then got a little bit drier, or really not dry, but more normal come summertime.
We've got some ranchers in that southwestern corner, southeastern Alberta area that aren't going to like what you just told us, Scott.
I know I've been hearing a lot of criticism of my forecast in the Western Prairies. They've been wanting rain for a long time, and the unfortunate thing is you're in a much drier climate to begin with, and then when you don't get rain, that just makes it much worse.
Yeah. Okay. Let's make sure we hit on. Well, actually, before I go forward, I want to ask you one more question about the prairies, and that is heat-wise. You mentioned the precipitation for air temperature for the summertime for the prairies. What are you expecting there?
So that follows a similar trend to precipitation. We're expecting that the western prairies will generally be a warmer growing season, and in the east, a more normal growing season in terms of temperature. But when I say normal, that's really an average of two different pieces of the season. So the spring will probably start cooler, and we've already seen that in the east, and then turn hotter as we get more into the summer. So the hotter summer and the cooler spring will balance out to be close to normal.
Okay, I want to ask you about Eastern Canada. They have also had a bit of a slow start. It's been cool. We had snowstorms and ice storms last week in the eastern part of Ontario. But then, as I mentioned at the beginning, southwestern Ontario experiencing a pretty nice week of weather here. People talking about why the Blue Jays, the Rogers Center wasn't open yesterday. So what can we expect here for the remaining parts of spring as farmers try to hit the field there in Eastern Canada?
Well, Eastern Canada has been off to a fairly strange start to the year. Eastern North America in general has had a very warm winter, but at the same time, they've had a lot of snow and ice at times as well. And now, snow and ice threat is probably over, as Eastern Canada doesn't really tend to get winter weather in spring like the Prairies does, except in very rare cases. So that's probably out of the way. And now we're seeing a very dramatic change over to mid 20s, especially in southern Ontario again today. It's in the mid 20s. So it looks like for them, conditions are becoming quite favorable. Proceeding now as we get into summertime, when it comes to the east, it's things get very tricky because they have a lot of thunderstorm activity like we do in the prairies. And so the ability to predict precipitation trends there, like in Western Canada, is difficult because of that. We don't make a summer forecast for the East because we're focused on the prairies. So I can't say what we're expecting for the entire growing season there, but do expect that you'll get very variable amounts of precipitation as we get into May and June, with thunderstorm activity picking up. And actually, they've already seen quite a bit of thunderstorm activity in southern Ontario.
Yeah, how about from an air temperature perspective here in the spring, as farmers are looking to wait for that soil to be fit to hit the field at that ideal time? A lot of people talking about soil temperature. It's not the only factor, but that's one of the components here of the soil being fit when especially when we're trying to put corn in the ground, because it is quite a sensitive crop in those early stages. So how warm will the spring be as we transition here to May?
Well, it does look like the central part of Eastern Canada, by that I mean more Ontario. Quebec will probably start with a warmer spring, carrying off the relatively warm winter they've had. And we're already seeing those, pretty warm temperatures there. So the fact that they don't tend to have deep frost in Eastern Canada, along with this earlier spring, will probably mean a pretty good start to the growing season for them. Atlantic Canada is a bit cooler to start, but again, they don't have deep frost like the Prairies does. So if they get a fairly quick switch to warmer weather a little later this month, things could pick up there pretty quickly as well.
When you look at the overall Canadian geography, what's the weather wild card for this year? I know we don't get consistent weather across the entire country, though it feels like this early spring has been very connected, where it's just been cool everywhere and kind of unstable. But what's the wild card to watch out for here in 23?
Well, I think the wild card this year, like it is almost every year, is the prevalence of thunderstorms. Whenever you're dealing with a thunderstorm, you're talking about a phenomena that's on the scale of only kilometers in width. And so if you're in an area that gets a series of thunderstorms moving over, you get an entire month's worth of rain in a matter of days, or even in extreme cases, hours. And so that makes a huge difference, particularly on the prairies where you don't have as much growing season precipitation to start with. If you have a lot of thunderstorm activity, that changes things entirely. And in the past few years, we haven't seen especially active thunderstorm patterns, but now that we're moving into an El Nino, typically El Nino brings more thunderstorm activity, especially in the eastern prairies. And so for farmers there, I'd watch out for that. And then in the east, thunderstorm activity is also important, particularly in southern Ontario and Quebec. And so that similar phenomenon plays out there, although the correlation with El Nino may not be as strong.
Now, my understanding is with La Nino, not great growing conditions for Australia, more positive for the Canadian geography, especially from precipitation standpoint. But the transition from La Nina to La Nino, it's not like it's sort of like one ends and the other one begins, is kind of how I understand it. This transition to the opportunity for more precipitation in the western half of the US and the western Canadian prairies, it's sort of like it's sort of classified. Like we'll know when we need to know. It's not a quick transition. Is that correct? Am I reading that right?
I'd say that's pretty fair to say. The other thing about the transition from one pattern to the other is that it's not something which you can always count on occurring, every month of a growing season or even every month when this is in place. So you'll have broad periods of time, let's say seasons or years, where you can sense that El Nino is playing a role, but other factors also come into play as well. El Nino only refers to the temperatures in the central Pacific Ocean, but the northern Pacific Ocean also plays a role in prairie climate. And so if its influence increases or decreases, that can affect our weather as well. So because the central Pacific is a very, very large area, it's one of the more dominant factors that affects us. But remember that even if you're in an El Nino pattern, that doesn't mean that the weather can suddenly change to be a lot less El Nino-like for short periods of time before it goes back into that more prevailing pattern.
What we need is like one of those Colorado lows. Instead of kind of taking that sort of diagonal path where it hits like South Dakota and North Dakota and Manitoba, it'd be nice if it actually hit like East End Saskatchewan. Just sort of divert and go a little bit more vertical. That would really help us out.
Well, the word Colorado low is either a blessing or a curse, depending where you live. If you're in Manitoba, you don't want to hear the word Colorado low ever again, because we had about what was it, 400 millimeters of rain in April, May, June last year from them, and people almost didn't get seeded. But if you're in the Western Prairies, you'd love to get them. So as a Manitoba person, I'm happy to send all our Colorado lows out your way.
Montana would thank you too, by the way. Okay. Hey, this has been great, Scott. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a great week.